welcome to this new 12-week course called the Popular Gothic Novel. I'm Dr. Divya and I teach English Literature in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at IIT Madras. Now, this course is going to be focused more on the British Gothic. It will begin by talking about the early popular Gothic that was produced in Great Britain. We'll begin from the late 18th century and move across the 19th century and finish up with The Hound of Baskervilles, which was published in 1901. The Gothic is a baggy genre. Today, it has come to mean anything which is dark, sinister, and explores taboo subjects as well. But it had a particular set of attributes when it began to emerge as a very structured genre in the late 18th century. So this course is going to introduce you to the concept of the Gothic in the literary domain, and I hope it will kind of encourage you to explore this Gothic mode in other literary domains across periods and across nations to the contemporary times as well, and in other genres too. Now let's take a quick look at the syllabus for this course. In week 1, I'll be introducing you to the Gothic. I will talk you through the nature of the Gothic motives, the idea of sublimity, the difference between terror and horror, and other related ideas. In week 2, we'll be exploring in depth Anne Radcliffe's The Mysteries of Udolpho, and I will be discussing the idea of the explained supernatural, the idea of the right sentimentality, nature of aristocratic villainy, and so on. In week 3, we'll talk about Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and the idea of the female Gothic. We will see how feminine anxieties are explored in the novel. We'll talk about scientific monsters and haunted landscapes and their relationship to the idea of the Gothic. In week 4, we'll talk about Northanger Abbey, the parody that Jane Austen produced of the Gothic obsession with the reading public in those times. And we will see how this mock Gothic is also very seriously Gothic in a different way when we explore this particular novel. Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights will kind of lead us into the idea of the Byronic hero and ghostly women. We'll talk about the relationship between realism and fantasy, violence and cruelty, and how all these associated dark subjects relates to the notion of the Gothic. Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte will follow in week 6, and we'll talk about the idea of Gothic symbolism and the idea of rebellion, and that rebellion in itself becomes a fantastic subject for a realism come Gothic nightmare that Jane Eyre is. In week 7, we'll talk about Charles Dickens's A Christmas Carol. We'll talk about the spectral city, how morality is kind of taught through a grotesque Gothic, and how this particular novella becomes an allegory for the right life. In week 8, we'll talk about Bram Stoker's Dracula. We'll talk about vampires and how the Gothic becomes a fantastic mode to talk about moral degeneration and late Victorian anxieties. In week 9, Moonstone, written by Wilkie Collins, will be a useful novel to talk about the Imperial Gothic and how ideas of mysticism, irrationality, otherness, and empire are channeled through the Gothic mode in this particular novel, which is also known as a great detective novel. In week 10, we'll talk about Doyle, The Hound of Baskervilles, and this novel is a very useful novel to talk about Gothic crime and how anxieties of the past and future are channeled through this particular novel, which is kind of making use of a lot of the Gothic motifs to produce a thriller in that period. In week 11, we'll talk about Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray. It is a novel which makes use of the idea of degenerating aesthetics to talk about dark ambitions, and through dark ambitions, Gothic terror is communicated to the reader. Finally, we'll talk about how Gothic gets accommodated in domestic realism in different forms and in different genres. So you can see how very malleable this Gothic mode is, and it continues to exist today because of the fascination that the human has towards the idea of being frightened. Thank you for watching. Hopefully, I'll see you on the course.